It was Christmas Eve when my mother's voice cut through the doorway like a blade. "Don't ever come back here again." The porch light flickered behind her, throwing long shadows across the snow that glistened under my boots. My father stood silent beside her, arms folded tight across his chest, his face carved from stone. I didn't beg, and I didn't cry. The air was sharp enough to sting as I stepped off that porch snow, soaking through my shoes, while every flake whispered that something inside me had frozen for good. That night, I walked away from the only home I had ever known, and 5 years later, they would wish they had never said those words. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to walk away just to protect your peace. I grew up in Seattle, in a house where everything looked perfect from the outside. My mother, Evelyn, believed that reputation wasn't just important, it was sacred. She'd glide through the kitchen every morning in pressed slacks and lipstick that never smudged, reminding me that a Mitchell woman should always look composed. My father, Charles, rarely raised his voice, but when he did, it wasn't to comfort, it was to correct. He measured worth in silence and compliance. Our home smelled of polished wood and expensive candles, yet it never really smelled like warmth. Then there was my sister Caroline. She was 3 years older, and the center of everything my parents admired. Straight-A student, flawless smile, a future lawyer with the kind of confidence that drew praise like a magnet. Family dinners felt more like showcases, Evelyn bragging about Caroline's achievements while I sat quietly helping refill water glasses just to feel useful. Whenever relatives came over, my mother would pat my shoulder and say Lauren's still finding her path with a smile so tight it hurt to look at. I learned early that in our family, love wasn't unconditional. It had to be earned through perfection. For a long time, I tried to play my role. I kept the peace, stayed polite, and said thank you when compared to my sister, even when the comparison burned. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I followed their rules closely enough, I might finally be seen. But every small success I shared at the dinner table disappeared under Caroline's spotlight. My promotion at the insurance office became nice. Her new position at a law firm became outstanding. My parents clapped for her, not for me. I learned to smile through the sting, swallowing words that wanted to escape. I was 20 when I met Daniel Harris. It was late spring gray clouds hanging low over the city, and my old sedan had given up again outside a corner auto shop. Daniel came out wiping his hands on a rag, his hair a little messy, his grin easy. "Battery's gone," he said, tapping the hood, "but I can get you back on the road." He didn't talk down to me, didn't make me feel small for not knowing a thing about cars. When he offered to grab coffee while we waited for parts, I said yes without thinking. We sat in his truck outside a small diner, steam fogging the windows as rain pattered against the glass. He told me about growing up with little about fixing things because no one else could afford to. I told him about my parents, how nothing I did ever seemed good enough. He listened without judgment, just nodding slowly before saying, "Maybe they're measuring the wrong things." That single line stayed with me longer than I expected. Weeks turned into months. I started dropping by the shop after work, bringing sandwiches and learning how to check oil levels just to spend more time with him. His world was loud, real, and unpolished, nothing like the glass-smooth calm of my parents' home. He laughed with his whole face worked until his hands were raw and still found joy in the smallest things. With Daniel, I felt seen in a way I never had before. But even then, a quiet dread followed me, whispering how my parents would react. When I finally told my mother about him, she looked at me as if I'd confessed to a sin. "A mechanic, Lauren," she asked, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You went to college. You could do better." My father didn't say much, just folded his newspaper tighter until it crinkled. Caroline tried to soften the blow later, saying gently, "They just want what's best for you, though." Her eyes told me she agreed with them. From that day forward, every dinner turned into a cross-examination. "Does he even have health insurance?" my mother would ask. "What's his plan for the future?" my father added, his fork poised like a gavel. I wanted to tell them that Daniel worked harder than anyone I'd ever known, that he dreamed of opening his own garage, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I nodded, pretending not to hear the disappointment woven through every question. At night, I'd lie awake listening to the rain against my window, trying to imagine what love without judgment might feel like. I I thought about how my parents' house, with all its fine china and cold marble floors, never once felt like home. Daniel's small apartment above the shop smelled of coffee and motor oil, but somehow it felt closer to peace than anything I'd known. Still, I wasn't ready to let go of the hope that my parents might change. I told myself they'd come around once they saw how genuine he was, but deep down, I sensed something shifting like a crack running through the foundation of our family. I just didn't know how deep it went or how close it was to breaking wide open. And that winter, with Christmas approaching and the city lights glowing across rain-slick streets, I would soon learn that even the smallest crack can split a family clean in two. The months after I told my parents about Daniel changed everything. Dinners that used to be stiff but tolerable turned into interrogations. Every meal was another reminder that I didn't fit the picture they wanted for their family. My mother would pick at her food, asking pointed questions about Daniel's job or his future, her tone coated in politeness, sharp enough to cut. My father rarely looked up from his plate, but when he did, his eyes carried quiet judgment, like he was already disappointed in whatever answer I gave. It didn't matter that Daniel treated me with respect, that he showed up every morning before sunrise to open his garage, or that he worked late fixing cars for customers who couldn't pay him right away. None of that counted to them. To Evelyn and Charles Mitchell, success came with a title and a pressed suit, not with grease-stained hands and long hours under a car hood. My sister Caroline stayed silent during those dinners, sipping her wine with the same practiced calm she used in court. But the way her eyes flicked toward me, full of polite pity, said enough. I started finding reasons to leave the house early. I stayed later at work, claimed extra shifts that didn't exist, anything to delay walking into that tension again. When my mother couldn't reach me, she began leaving messages on my phone, always the same mix of guilt and control. "You're breaking your father's heart," she'd say. "You're better than this." But whenever I came home, the house was dark, the only light a thin glow from their bedroom window. Sometimes I'd stand at the foot of the stairs, hearing their voices through the door. My mother's tone was soft, almost mournful. "She's drifting," she'd say. My father would grunt in agreement, the sound of a glass setting down on a nightstand, following like a period at the end of a sentence. I'd lie awake in my room, staring at the ceiling, wondering when I'd stopped being their daughter and started being their disappointment. I wanted to believe things would settle with time, that they'd see Daniel the way I did, but the gap only grew wider. Even the walls felt like they carried judgment lined with family portraits, where Caroline's smile always seemed a little brighter than mine. That winter came early. The air over Seattle turned sharp and wet, and I could feel the cold between us solidify into something permanent. My family still invited me to dinners and gatherings, but each invitation came with an edge, a test I never passed. At Caroline's engagement party, the divide became impossible to ignore. The ballroom was everything my mother loved: white roses, soft jazz chandeliers that sparkled like they knew who they belonged to. Caroline floated from table to table, in a silver dress, her fiancé Richard by her side, every inch the perfect couple. I stood near the dessert table, clutching a glass of champagne I didn't want. My mother found me there, her voice calm and precise under the hum of the crowd. "You should think about your future, Lauren. Your sister is marrying stability. You're playing house with a man who changes tires." Her words landed softly, but they cut deep. I stepped outside before I could respond, rain mixing with tears I refused to let fall. Daniel followed a moment later, slipping his jacket over my shoulders. "Let it go," he said quietly. "They don't know us." I wanted to believe him, but behind the glass doors I could see my mother's reflection watching us, her expression cool and certain. That was the night I stopped expecting her approval. After that, I called less. I stopped showing up to dinners. I poured my energy into helping Daniel with his dream of opening his own shop. We spent weekends sorting through spreadsheets, budgeting every cent, talking about how good it would feel to have a place that was ours. For a while it worked. We laughed again. We believed in small steps. But every time I ran into someone from my family, an aunt at the grocery store, a cousin at a cafe, the questions returned. Still with that mechanic, they'd ask, with a sympathetic smile, "You must be so patient." Their tone made it sound like endurance, not love. Caroline's comments were the worst. Not cruel, but careful. I heard Daniel's still renting, she'd say, tilting her head. Isn't he a bit stuck? I never knew if she meant to hurt me or if she thought she was being kind. Either way, it reminded me how my family measured everything worth love, happiness against the same narrow scale. Success wasn't about effort. It was about presentation. By December, I barely recognized the version of me my parents spoke about at their parties. In their stories, I was a lost cause, a cautionary tale for younger cousins to avoid. They didn't see the long nights Daniel and I spent working towards something real or how much strength it took to start from nothing. But I felt it. Every word, every look, every silence stacked up inside me like weight pressing down. When Caroline called a week before Christmas, her voice was unusually soft. "Mom wants you to come to dinner," she said. "Just dinner." She's calmer now. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Daniel offered to drive me, and when we pulled up to the house, the front windows glowed like they always had perfect symmetrical cold. Inside, everything was in its place. Garland wrapped neatly around the staircase, candles flickered on the mantel, and the table was set with crystal dishes that never saw daily use. My mother barely looked up when I walked in. "You're late," she said, straightening a fork. My father stood by the fireplace, a drink in hand, his attention fixed on the news. Caroline gave me a small smile, polite but distant. Dinner started in silence. The turkey was perfect, the cranberry sauce smooth, but no one spoke until my mother did. So she said, not looking up, "You're still with the mechanic?" I nodded once. She set her fork down with a soft clink. "Lauren, you're wasting your life." I kept my voice calm. "He's starting his own business. We're doing fine." She laughed lightly, almost kindly. "Fine. Is that what you want for yourself?" "Just fine," my father added without looking up. "You could have been like your sister." I stared at my plate, my pulse loud in my ears. Caroline tried to interject. "Mom, maybe we should," but my mother cut her off. "No, she needs to hear this. You're embarrassing this family, living with that man, letting people talk." Something inside me cracked. I heard my own voice before I could stop it. "At least he's honest," I said quietly. "He doesn't pretend to love me for show." The room fell silent. My mother's face went pale, then hardened. She stood slowly, her napkin falling to the floor. "If you walk out with him tonight," she said, her voice trembling with fury, "don't ever come back here again." The fire behind her hissed, and snow drifted past the window. My father didn't speak, didn't move. I looked at Caroline, searching for anything, a word, a gesture, but she only lowered her eyes. I stood, my hands shaking as I reached for my bag. Then I guess this is goodbye. When I opened the door, the cold hit like a slap. Snow was falling fast, melting on my skin before disappearing into the dark. Behind me, the door closed with a soft click that sounded final. I walked down the steps and into the street, Daniel's truck idling at the curb. The porch light flickered once more before fading. That was the night everything ended, the night I stopped being their daughter and became something else entirely. I didn't know it then, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the one waiting ahead. The night I walked away from my parents' house, the cold hit harder than I expected. Snow clung to my coat, melted, then froze again as I crossed the quiet street toward Daniel's truck. The engine idled under the soft hiss of falling flakes, headlights carving through the white. I climbed in without a word. Daniel didn't ask what happened. He just reached over, turned up the heat, and drove. The silence between us said enough. We stayed at his apartment that night, a small space above the auto shop that smelled faintly of oil and rain. For a while it was enough, a warm bed, a roof, and the feeling that I had someone in my corner. But the weeks that followed blurred into something different. My mother's words echoed in the back of my mind, sharp and heavy, and I could see the distance growing between Daniel and me with every passing day. By mid-January, he stopped coming home before midnight. The shop was busier, he said, or so he claimed. I believed him at first. Then one evening I stopped by to bring him dinner, and through the cracked door I heard laughter, a woman's voice, light and familiar. When I stepped inside, the room fell quiet. A girl I'd never met was leaning against the counter, twirling his wrench between her fingers. Daniel's eyes met mine, tired and guilty. "Lauren," he said softly, "I didn't ask you to follow me." That was all it took. I didn't argue or cry. I packed a duffel bag that night and left before sunrise, the streets slick with leftover rain. The next few weeks were a patchwork of motel rooms, borrowed couches, and nights in my car parked behind a gas station. The rain barely stopped, and when it did, the air stayed heavy and gray. My money ran out faster than I'd planned. One morning, I sat in my car engine off wrapped in a blanket, watching the condensation cloud the windows until it looked like I was trapped inside a dream I couldn't wake from. That afternoon, I pulled into a bus depot just to get warm. The lights inside flickered yellow over cracked tile floors and vending machines humming in the corner. A driver noticed me sitting there, shaking my hands tucked into my sleeves. He looked about mid-40s, his uniform jacket zipped to the collar. "You okay, miss?" he asked, voice gentle but firm. I nodded automatically. "You don't look okay," he said, setting his coffee down. "Let me drive you somewhere safe." His name was Greg Allen. I told him I didn't have anywhere to go. He pulled a few bills from his wallet and pressed them into my hand. "There's an inn near the highway," he said. "They'll take cash, no questions." I tried to refuse, but he shook his head. "Pay it forward someday, that's all." That small act of kindness, simple quiet, carried me through that night. The inn was barely more than a row of doors and a buzzing sign, but it was warm. I lay awake staring at the water stains on the ceiling, listening to the sound of trucks passing by, and thought about how quickly a life can shrink. 1 month ago, I had a family, a home, a plan. Now I had a key that didn't fit any door that mattered. The next morning, I found an old contact card in my phone, Wendy Ross, my best friend from high school. We hadn't spoken in almost a year. I hesitated, then called. She answered on the second ring, her voice familiar and bright. "Lauren, oh my God, is that you?" The moment I heard her tone, something in my chest loosened. I told her everything, the fight Daniel, the night sleeping in my car. She didn't hesitate. "Come here," she said. "You're not doing this alone." Wendy lived in a small one-bedroom apartment above a coffee shop in Capitol Hill. The stairs creaked and the hallway smelled faintly of roasted beans and old paint, but it was the warmest place I'd been in months. Her couch sagged in the middle, and her cat hissed at me for the first week, but it was safe. The morning after I moved in, she handed me a mug of instant coffee and 2 folded 20s. "It's not much," she said, setting them on the table, "but it's a start." I spent the next few days combing job listings, circling ads in the free newspaper. Wendy worked nights at a diner downtown and got me a shift cleaning tables. The pay was low, but it was steady. I learned to stretch $1 instant noodles, secondhand clothes, walking instead of taking the bus. Each small decision built a routine that slowly pulled me out of the fog. Winter dragged on, and the city stayed soaked in gray, but something inside me began to thaw. I'd walk to work before sunrise, watching the neon lights flicker off one by one, the smell of rain mixing with the hum of the first buses rolling through. The rhythm of it, the quiet mornings, the sound of my shoes on wet pavement felt like rebuilding one step at a time. One night after closing, I noticed a flyer pinned to the diner's bulletin board: evening accounting courses, community college, open enrollment. The paper was wrinkled and sun-faded, but the words felt like a door cracking open. Numbers had always made sense to me. They didn't twist or judge, they just balanced or didn't. I tore the flyer down and took it home. The first semester nearly broke me. I worked double shifts to afford tuition, studied until 2 in the morning, and caught the last bus home. Wendy would fall asleep on the couch beside me while I tried to memorize formulas under the soft glow of her desk lamp. Some nights I thought about quitting. Then I'd remember my mother's voice, "You're wasting your life," and I'd turn another page. Little by little, things changed. I moved from wiping counters to running the register. I saved enough to buy a used laptop and a bus pass that didn't run out midweek. Every small victory felt like proof that I could stand without leaning on anyone. 2 years later, I completed the program with a certificate in accounting. On my first day at a small financial firm downtown, I walked into the office and saw my name printed neatly on the glass door, Lauren Mitchell Accounting Department. I stood there for a moment, letting it sink in. It wasn't just a title, it was something solid I'd built with my own hands. That afternoon, I stepped outside onto the street, the air cool but not cold, and realized the city didn't feel heavy anymore. The same rain that once chilled me now smelled like something clean and new. For the first time in years, I wasn't running from anyone's expectations. I was simply walking forward. That peace didn't look like revenge. It looked like stability, like coffee brewing in the morning and bills paid on time. It looked like sleeping without fear. And even though my parents' words still echoed in the back of my mind, they didn't have the power to shape me anymore. I didn't know it yet, but that sense of calm was only the beginning. Because soon a chance meeting would lead me into a world my parents could never have imagined, one that would bring our paths face to face again. The first morning I walked into my new office downtown, I could hardly breathe. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee. My name, Lauren Mitchell, Accounting Department, was printed on a glass panel outside a small corner room. It was simple, but it felt like the world had shifted. I set my bag down, ran my fingers over the polished desk, and for a long moment just stood there, letting the quiet fill me. For the first time in years, the ground beneath me didn't feel temporary. The weeks that followed moved fast. There was order again, schedules, invoices, deadlines that made sense. Numbers had a calmness people rarely did. I worked late most nights, staying until the cleaning crew came through, because I liked the stillness of the office when everyone else had gone home. Sometimes I'd walk out onto the street after dark, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement, and realize how much the world could change without warning. One afternoon, near the end of my first month, I met Raymond Cole. He came into the office to set up a retirement account for teachers in his district. He was tall, a little older than me, with a calm voice that filled the room without effort. He waited patiently as I reviewed his paperwork, and when he smiled, it wasn't the polite kind people give out of habit, it was steady, genuine. Before he left, he asked if I'd like to grab coffee sometime. I said yes before I could overthink it. We met the next evening at a small cafe near the library. The air outside was cool, the kind of spring chill that still carried traces of winter rain. He asked about my work, my classes, and what made me choose accounting. I told him it wasn't about numbers, it was about truth. You can't argue with a balance sheet. He laughed softly and said, "That makes sense. I teach history for the same reason." We sat there until the lights dimmed, talking about simple things, books, music, places we'd never been but hoped to see someday. When he walked me home, he didn't reach for my hand. He just kept pace beside me, matching every step. Over the months that followed, peace slowly replaced survival. My apartment grew from a borrowed couch into a real home, hand-me-down furniture, thrifted curtains, and the faint scent of lavender that lingered from the candle Wendy left behind when she moved in with her boyfriend. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Raymond and I spent weekends exploring the city, finding quiet spots by the waterfront, or cooking dinner at his place while jazz played low in the background. He never asked about my family, and I didn't offer. 5 years after the night I walked away from that porch, my life finally felt steady. I had a job, I respected friends who checked in, and someone who saw me as I was, not as a reflection of someone else's disappointment. I didn't think about my parents much anymore, but sometimes on quiet evenings I'd catch myself wondering if they ever thought about me. That summer, my supervisor, Laura Chen, stopped by my desk holding a folder marked with a blue tab. "Lauren, you'll handle this," she said with a small smile. "A major charity gala downtown next month. We're one of the corporate sponsors." I nodded, flipping through the document's standard donation paperwork, tax details, and an invitation printed on heavy cream stock. I didn't notice the name at first. When I did, my fingers stilled. The Mitchell Family Foundation, Annual Fundraising Gala. Laura noticed my pause. "They requested someone from accounting to deliver the donation check personally," she said. "You'd represent the firm." Her tone was kind, unaware of the weight behind those words. I smiled steady enough to hide the twist in my chest. "Of course," I said. "I'll take care of it." The night of the gala arrived with rain that came down in soft sheets, blurring the lights of downtown Seattle into a wash of gold and silver. I arrived early wearing a long black dress that fit neatly at the shoulders, simple but strong. The Hyatt ballroom gleamed with chandeliers and polished marble, the kind of setting my mother used to describe as respectable. Guests drifted in their laughter, echoing under the music of a string quartet. Laura waved me over from across the room. "You'll present the check after dinner," she said, her lipstick catching the light. "Don't worry. It's all routine." I nodded, though my heart had already begun to thud beneath my ribs. Every sound, the clink of glassware, the polite chatter, the music felt too familiar, like echoes from a life I no longer belonged to. When the MC's voice announced the hosts, I froze. "Please welcome the Moore." He stopped, correcting himself with a quick smile. "The Mitchell Family Foundation." My surname rolled through the hall, heavier than I remembered. And then I saw them. My mother stood near the stage, elegant as ever in navy silk, her hair swept into a perfect twist. My father was beside her, slower now, a touch of gray at his temples, but still carrying that same quiet command. And there, guiding a hand across her rounded belly, was Caroline, glowing confident, unchanged. For a moment, none of them noticed me. It was like watching a performance I'd already left halfway through. I turned toward the bar, ordered sparkling water, and tried to steady my breathing. But then my mother's gaze moved across the room. She paused mid-sentence, her expression flickering from confusion to recognition. She whispered something to Caroline, who followed her eyes, then to my father. One by one, their faces turned toward me. They didn't come closer. Not yet. Dinner began. Waiters moved in careful rhythm, setting plates of salmon and risotto in front of us. My name appeared on the printed program beside the words "Corporate Donation Presentation, Northbridge Financial, represented by Lauren Mitchell." I saw my mother's hand tremble slightly as she read it. When the MC finally called me to the stage, the sound of my heels against the floor echoed through the ballroom. Each step was deliberate, steady, the same rhythm as the footsteps I'd taken through snow that night years ago. The lights softened as I took the microphone. "Good evening," I said, my voice carrying across the room. "On behalf of Northbridge Financial, we're honored to support the Mitchell Family Foundation's work with youth housing because no one deserves to be turned away from home." A quiet murmur rippled through the audience. My mother's face went still. I held the oversized check in both hands and smiled, calm and certain. "This donation comes from people who believe in second chances. Sometimes when one door closes, life opens another." I didn't mention names. I didn't need to. The silence that followed spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. The MC cleared his throat and began the applause. Dozens of strangers clapped, unaware of what had just passed between us. I stepped down from the stage, handed the folder to Laura, and turned toward the exit. My mother reached me before I could leave. "Lauren," she said, her voice low and tight, "you could have warned us." I met her eyes evenly. "You warned me first," I said softly. "Remember." Her jaw trembled. "That night we were scared. We didn't mean I stopped her before she could finish. You meant it," I said. "And maybe you needed to. Because if you hadn't, I might still be trying to earn a seat at your table." Caroline stood behind her, tears glinting in her eyes. "Mom regrets everything," she whispered. "She really does." I nodded once. Maybe I said, "But I didn't come here for that. I came because I built something you said I never could." My father spoke for the first time, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "We're proud of you," he said. The words hung there between us, too late to change what they'd broken. I gave a small smile. "Pride used to mean everything to you," I said. "Now it means nothing to me." For a moment, none of us moved. Around us, the music swelled and laughter rose again. The lights gleamed off crystal glasses, and I watched my family's image blur in the reflection of the ballroom mirrors, elegant, composed, and already fading from my world. Raymond appeared beside me, his hand warm against my back. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, steady. "Better than okay." He glanced toward the door. "Then let's go." As we stepped out into the night, the rain had turned to mist, soft and silver under the streetlights. The city glimmered beneath it, reflections rippling in every puddle. Behind me, through the glass, I could see my parents standing together under the ballroom light, small figures in a scene I no longer belonged to. I took one last look and let it go. Raymond opened the car door, but I paused, breathing in the cool air that smelled of rain and freedom. "That them?" he asked gently. I nodded. Yeah, I said, that's them. He waited. You want to talk to them? I smiled faintly. No. They'll talk to themselves, regrets loud enough. He nodded once, then started the car. As we drove through the quiet streets, the city lights stretched like silver threads across the wet pavement. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to look back. The road ahead wasn't just escape, it was proof that I'd survived, rebuilt, and risen without permission. And somewhere in that glittering city, the people who once doubted me were finally left to face what they'd lost. The rain followed us all the way home that night. It came down steady, a soft rhythm against the windshield as Raymond drove through downtown Seattle. Streetlights shimmered on the wet pavement, stretching long silver lines beneath the tires. Neither of us spoke. There wasn't much to say. The city felt washed clean, the air lighter somehow, like it had been waiting for that moment as long as I had. When we reached my apartment, Raymond parked under the awning and turned off the engine. The sound of the rain grew louder, surrounding us. You sure you're okay? He asked quietly. I nodded, my hand resting on the door handle. Yeah, I said. For the first time, I really am. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need words, then followed me upstairs. Inside, the warmth of the apartment met us like an embrace. The faint smell of coffee and lavender candles filled the air. I kicked off my heels and stood near the window watching the city glow beneath the mist. 5 years ago, I'd stood in front of a different window, cold, shivering, hoping for mercy. Tonight, I felt steady. My reflection in the glass no longer looked like someone trying to belong. It looked like someone who finally did. Raymond came up behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist, his chin resting lightly on my shoulder. Still thinking about them, he asked. I shook my head. Not really. Just closing the chapter. He didn't press further. He just held me there quiet while the rain softened to a drizzle outside. The next morning, I woke early sunlight peeking through the blinds. The city outside was still damp, but the sky was finally clear. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, letting the steam rise from the cup. My phone buzzed once, an unfamiliar number. I didn't recognize it until I saw the signature at the end of the message. Mom. The text was short. We shouldn't have said what we did. Please call when you can. I stared at the screen for a long moment before turning the phone face down on the table. I didn't delete it. I didn't answer either. Later that week at the office, Laura stopped by my desk. You handled yourself beautifully at that gala, she said, setting a folder down. Professional composed, the board noticed. You've got a real future here. Her praise was kind, but the compliment that followed meant more. You've got quiet strength, Lauren. That's rare. I thanked her, but my mind was elsewhere. Her words echoed as I walked home that evening, rain boots splashing through shallow puddles. Quiet strength. It was something I'd never been called before. All my life, my parents had seen silence as weakness, but now that same silence had built me a life they couldn't touch. Days turned into weeks, and life settled back into rhythm. Raymond and I spent weekends walking through Pike Place Market, buying fresh flowers and bread still warm from the oven. Sometimes we'd stop by the park near the pier where children ran through the grass and seagulls circled above. Seattle's rain still came and went without warning, but it no longer felt heavy. It just felt like home. One Saturday afternoon, I got a letter in the mail, not a text, not an email, but a handwritten note on the kind of stationery my mother always used. The handwriting was elegant, careful. Lauren, I hope you'll read this. Your father hasn't been well. We've been thinking of you. Please visit when you're ready. It ended with a single line, Love, Mom. I folded the paper neatly and set it aside. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't ready either. Raymond found me standing by the window later that evening, the letter still in my hand. What are you going to do? He asked. I exhaled slowly. Nothing. Not yet. He nodded, understanding. In the months that followed, I threw myself into work. Promotions came quietly, one after another. By the end of the year, I was leading a small team, training new hires, balancing accounts worth more than I'd ever imagined touching. Laura often said I had a gift for clarity, for finding calm where others found panic. Sometimes I thought about where that clarity had come from, the years spent trying to read silence, to make sense of words that cut, and smiles that never reached the eyes. When the next winter arrived, it brought snow, thick white, falling softly over the city, like the night that had started everything. Raymond and I were driving back from his sister's house when he glanced out the window and said, "Looks like your kind of night." I smiled faintly. Maybe I said, "Except this time, I'm not walking away from anything." Back home, I stood by the window again, watching the snow gather on the fire escape. The city lights flickered below, warm and golden against the cold. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my mother. "We're hosting a family dinner next Sunday. Caroline will be there. We'd like to see you." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I turned off the lamp and let the darkness fill the room, broken only by the soft glow of the city outside. For a long time, I had chased the idea of belonging to them. Now, standing in my own home, with the man I loved asleep in the next room, I realized I already belonged somewhere, just not there. That night, I drafted a short reply. "Thank you for the invitation. I hope you and Dad are well. I'm not ready to visit yet, but I wish you both peace." I hit send and set the phone down. The screen dimmed, and with it, the last pull of old expectations seemed to fade. As the year turned, I took on a volunteer role through the foundation I'd once donated to managing a financial literacy program for young adults aging out of foster care. The first night I stood at the front of the classroom, a group of nervous faces looked up at me, notebooks open. I told them how numbers can build freedom, how knowing where every dollar goes is a kind of power no one can take away. In their eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in my own for years. Hope fragile, but real. After class, I sat in my car for a while, listening to the rain against the roof. I thought of Greg, the bus driver, who'd handed me money for a motel when I had nowhere to go. I thought of Wendy, who'd made space on her couch when I was lost. I made a note to send them both a thank you card, even if years had passed. Some debts can only be paid forward. One evening, as Raymond and I walked home from dinner, he stopped to look at a bookstore window filled with travel guides. "You ever think about leaving the city for a bit?" he asked. I thought about the years I'd spent trapped by expectations and smiled. Maybe just long enough to see the ocean somewhere warmer. He laughed. "Deal." The following spring, we booked 2 tickets to California, a week on the coast, no schedules, no past waiting around the corner. On the morning we left, I glanced once at my reflection in the mirror by the door. The same face, the same name, but not the same woman. As the plane lifted off and the clouds opened beneath us, I realized something simple and true. The past hadn't been erased, but it no longer defined me. And even though my parents might still be waiting for a version of me that no longer existed, I knew I had already found everything I needed: peace, purpose, and a life I built on my own terms. That peace, fragile as it once was, had become something solid. And as the clouds gave way to sunlight, I finally understood that the story I'd been living wasn't about loss anymore. It was about freedom and the quiet strength it takes to claim it. The spring we came back from California, everything in Seattle felt softer. The rain had lost its edge and the days stretched longer before dusk settled in. I'd taken a few extra days off before returning to the office, and Raymond spent those mornings reading by the window while I repotted the plants that had grown wild in our absence. The apartment smelled of soil and coffee sunlight, sliding through the blinds like it was finally allowed in. For the first time, peace didn't feel fragile. It felt earned. When I returned to work, Laura called me into her office. She was standing by the window papers spread out on her desk. "You've been doing exceptional work," she said, turning toward me. "There's a senior position opening up this summer. I'd like you to apply." The offer caught me by surprise. I had spent so many years climbing quietly that I'd never stopped to see how far I'd come. I thanked her, promising to think it over. That weekend, Raymond and I met some of his colleagues at a local art exhibit. The gallery was small, tucked between a bookstore and a bakery that smelled like warm cinnamon. Between conversations and soft laughter, I caught sight of a familiar face near the back of the room. Caroline stood by a painting of the Seattle skyline, her posture perfect, one hand resting protectively over her belly. For a moment, I thought I was imagining her until she turned and met my eyes. She hesitated before walking over. "Lauren," she said softly, as if testing the word. I hadn't seen her since the gala. "Hi," I said, keeping my tone even. She smiled, nervous and genuine at the same time. "I didn't expect to see you here. How have you been?" I glanced at Raymond, who gave a small nod and moved toward the refreshment table to give us space. Caroline took a breath. "Mom and Dad ask about you all the time," she said. "Dad's been having some heart trouble, nothing serious, but they worry." I nodded, unsure what to say. "They're still in the same house," she continued. "It's quieter now, different." Her words carried a weight I didn't fully recognize until she looked down, eyes shining. "They miss you." I thought about the message my mother had sent months ago, the letter I'd never answered. For years, silence had been the safest distance between us. But seeing my sister with the same eyes we both inherited from our father stirred something small and cautious inside me. "How's the baby?" I asked quietly. Caroline's face softened. "Due in 2 months," she said. "It's a girl." For a while, we just stood there, surrounded by strangers and art and the faint hum of music. When she finally reached out and touched my arm, it wasn't like the old days. It wasn't pity or pretense. It was something closer to peace. "You should come by," she said. "No pressure, just dinner." That invitation lingered with me for days. I mentioned it to Raymond later that week. He listened without interrupting, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Do you want to go?" he asked. I thought about it carefully. "I don't know," I said. "But maybe it's time to stop carrying what isn't mine anymore." The following Sunday, I drove to my parents' house alone. The neighborhood looked almost the same, though the trees along the street had grown taller, shading the walkways. The porch light, the same one that once flickered behind my mother's warning, glowed steadily now. My hands tightened on the steering wheel before I finally stepped out. Evelyn opened the door before I could knock. She looked smaller than I remembered, her hair grayer, her posture still straight, but softer somehow. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. "Lauren," she said, her voice catching slightly. "You came." I nodded. Caroline said dinner was at 6. It was the safest answer I could give. Inside, the house smelled like rosemary and lemon, just like it used to during holidays. My father sat at the table, thinner, now his face lined but calm. He pushed himself up slowly when he saw me. "Lauren," he said, voice quiet but steady, "it's good to see you." I hesitated, then shook his hand. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close. Dinner passed in fragments, small talk about work, the weather, Caroline's baby. There were pauses, careful and polite, but not painful. My mother asked about my job, about Raymond, about the company gala from months ago. Her tone held no judgment, this time only curiosity. At one point, she reached across the table to refill my glass, her hand trembling slightly. "You've done well for yourself," she said. "Better than we ever expected." I looked at her for a moment, unsure if that was praise or regret. "I did what I had to," I said. She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "I know," she whispered. After dinner, I stepped outside for air. The garden was smaller than I remembered, but the hydrangeas along the fence were still there, just beginning to bloom. I heard the door creak behind me and turned to see my father step onto the porch. "Your mother talks about you," he said quietly. "More than she admits. She still keeps the photo from your graduation on her dresser." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. He leaned against the railing, his voice low. "We made mistakes, Lauren. We thought we were protecting you, teaching you strength. We were wrong." The words hung between us, heavy and strange. I could see the years in his face, the weight of what couldn't be undone. "I'm not angry anymore," I said finally, "but I can't go back to who I was." He gave a small nod. "I wouldn't ask you to." When I left that night, my mother stood by the door again, her hands clasped together. "Can we see you again?" she asked quietly. Not as an apology, just as family. I hesitated, then said, "We'll see." It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a refusal either. Driving home, the streetlights stretched long across the road, fading behind me one by one. The air outside was cool, the same crispness I remembered from the night I'd left. But this time the road ahead didn't feel lonely, it felt open. When I got home, Raymond was waiting in the living room, a book resting on his knee. "How was it?" he asked. I took off my coat and sat beside him. Strange, I said. Quiet. But maybe that's enough. He smiled softly. Sometimes quiet's where things finally start to heal. Outside, the rain began again, gentle, steady, familiar. I leaned my head against his shoulder, watching it streak the window. It wasn't the same kind of peace I'd felt the night I walked away. It was deeper, quieter, the kind that comes when the storm finally loses its power. And though I didn't know what the next chapter would bring, I understood something I hadn't before. Forgiveness didn't mean returning to the past. It meant standing where you were and realizing you'd survived it. The following months settled into a quiet rhythm. I spent most evenings at home balancing spreadsheets for work while Raymond graded essays across from me. The hum of the city through the window had become background music to our lives. We didn't talk much about the dinner at my parents' house. It was enough that it had happened that I'd walked in and out without bitterness trailing behind me. One afternoon in early autumn, I was finishing a report when Laura called me into her office. Her desk was covered with folders, the corner window catching the gray light over downtown. "You've done excellent work on the outreach program," she said. "Corporate's taken notice." She slid a letter across the desk. "They're promoting you to senior financial manager." For a moment, I just stared at the page. Years of night classes, long shifts, and quiet determination condensed into a single line of text. Laura smiled, seeing my hesitation. "You earned this, Lauren. Don't act surprised." That night, Raymond brought home a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. We sat by the window watching the rain streak down the glass. "I knew this was coming," he said. "You've been building toward it since the day I met you." I laughed, the sound quiet and light. "It feels different this time," I said, "like it's not just survival anymore." Over the next few weeks, I adjusted to the new role. My schedule grew heavier, but it came with a sense of control I'd never known. My office overlooked the waterfront, and sometimes when the sun broke through the clouds, I'd catch the reflection of the water flickering against the glass. It felt like a reminder that even the most constant rain had its breaks of light. One Friday evening, as I was packing up, my phone buzzed with a message from Caroline. "Mom's hosting a small gathering tomorrow, just family. We'd like you to come." I read it twice before setting the phone down. For years, those invitations had been wrapped in guilt or expectation. This one felt different, short, simple, almost careful. The next evening, I drove to the house again. The leaves along the driveway had turned red and gold, scattered across the front walk like confetti. When I stepped inside, laughter drifted from the living room. Caroline was on the couch, holding her baby, her husband beside her. My parents stood nearby, older but lighter somehow. My mother's eyes met mine first. She smiled, not the practiced social one I remembered, but something gentler. "Lauren," she said, "I'm glad you came." Dinner was relaxed, the air softer than I expected. The tension that once filled every corner of that house had loosened. My father asked about my promotion, proud in a quiet way. My mother listened more than she spoke. Her gaze steady, but unreadable. Caroline teased me for still keeping my phone on silent during meals, and we all laughed the kind of laughter that doesn't need permission. After dessert, I helped clear the table. My mother followed me into the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. For a long moment, we worked side by side in silence. Then she said, "You know, I've watched you from a distance these past years." Her voice was low, almost uncertain. "You built something solid, something good. I used to think strength meant control. Now I think it means what you've done standing alone when you have to." I didn't respond right away. The clatter of dishes filled the space between us. "It wasn't easy," I said finally, "but it was worth it." She nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm sorry for the years we made you feel small." The words came out uneven, like she wasn't sure how to shape them. I set down the dish I was holding. "I'm not asking for sorry," I said softly. "I just needed to be seen." When I turned to leave, she caught my hand gently. "You were always worth seeing," she whispered. "We just didn't know how." Later that night, as I was getting ready to go, Caroline hugged me at the door. "You should visit more often," she said. "It's better when you're here." I smiled. "Maybe I will." My father, standing nearby, gave a faint nod. "You know," he said, "your mother started volunteering at the youth shelter your company supports." That surprised me. He smiled almost shyly. "She said she wanted to understand the kind of work that changed you." Driving home, I thought about that conversation. It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation in any dramatic sense, it was something quieter. A shift in how we stood in the same space without the old weight between us. The next morning I woke to sunlight spilling through the blinds, the city unusually bright for late October. Raymond was making coffee in the kitchen, humming softly to himself. I joined him barefoot, wrapping my hands around the mug he handed me. "How was dinner?" he asked. "It was calm," I said. "No raised voices, no lectures. Just calm." He smiled. "Sounds like progress." I nodded. "It feels like everyone's learning how to speak a new language." Weeks later, my parents attended a corporate charity event my firm co-sponsored. It was the first time I'd seen them in a public space that didn't revolve around appearances. My mother approached me near the registration desk, dressed simply, no diamonds, no rigid posture. "Your speech tonight," she said. "I'm looking forward to it." When I took the stage later, I spotted her and my father in the crowd. They weren't the proud, calculating faces from years ago. They were simply listening. I spoke about opportunity, about second chances, about the people who taught me that dignity often begins when someone stops trying to impress and starts trying to understand. When the applause came, it wasn't for me alone. Afterward, my mother hugged me before I could react. "You did beautifully," she said. Her voice broke slightly. "I've never been prouder." For the first time, the word proud didn't sound like a performance. It sounded like truth. That night, Raymond and I drove home under a light drizzle. The skyline glowed behind us, the city reflecting off the water. "How do you feel?" he asked. I glanced out at the rain-streaked glass, the reflection of the city's lights flickering against it. "Like it's finally over," I said quietly. "Not forgotten, but finished." He reached over and took my hand, our fingers fitting together easily. The road stretched ahead calm and endless. The storm that had followed me for years had finally run out of places to land, and for the first time I could see the horizon not as an escape, but as everything still waiting to begin. The first snow of the year came late that winter. It fell in slow, steady flakes that caught the streetlights outside my window, the city moving quietly beneath them. I stood there for a while, coffee in hand, watching the world turn white again. It reminded me of the night everything began. The porch, the words, the cold, but this time the air felt calm, not cruel. Life had changed in ways I could finally name. My parents and I spoke occasionally now, not out of obligation, but choice. Our conversations were brief but genuine small threads, slowly weaving something new. Caroline sent pictures of her baby, a little girl with her father's eyes and our mother's smile. Every time I saw her, I thought about how family can start again, even when it breaks first. At work, the promotion brought new challenges, but also moments of pride. I spent most of my days mentoring younger staff people who reminded me of myself at the beginning, trying to prove their worth quietly. I told them the same thing Laura once told me, that strength doesn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it's just showing up day after day until the life you're building finally takes shape. One afternoon, Laura called me into her office. She had that easy smile that always made people feel seen. "The board's approved your proposal," she said. "The scholarship fund for financial literacy, you'll oversee it next quarter." I thanked her, feeling something warm settle in my chest. The idea had started as a small hope years ago, a way to give back to people who needed a chance to start over like I once did. Now it was real. That evening, I met Raymond at the waterfront. The air smelled of salt and rain, and ferries drifted across the sound under streaks of silver light. He handed me a paper cup of cocoa and smiled. "So, boss lady," he said, teasing gently, "what's next?" I laughed, the sound echoing softly against the water. "Not sure," I said, "but for once I don't feel like I have to rush to find out." We stood there in silence for a while, watching the last light fade behind the skyline. The city had been both my battlefield and my refuge, but now it just felt like home. I thought about Greg, the bus driver, who helped me on a freezing night with nothing but a few kind words and a motel key. I thought about Wendy, who gave up her couch so I could have a safe place to sleep. Every step forward in my life had been built on small acts of compassion from people who didn't owe me a thing. It was humbling how much good could come from simple kindness. Sometimes I still pass by the old neighborhood where my parents lived. The porch light was brighter now, steady instead of flickering. I didn't always stop, but when I did, it wasn't with anger, it was with quiet understanding. We were all learning, just at different speeds. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't something you handed out once. It was something you practiced again and again until it stopped hurting to remember. Back home, I opened the balcony door and let the cold air in. The snow was falling harder now, coating the rooftops and empty streets below. Raymond came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. "Still love watching it, don't you?" he said. I nodded. "It used to feel lonely," I whispered. "Now it just feels peaceful." He pressed a kiss to the top of my head, and we stood there until the city disappeared under a soft white hush. In that moment, I understood what all those years had been leading toward. Not victory, not revenge. Just peace, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone's approval, the kind you earn by choosing to keep going. If someone had told me years ago that the same snow that once marked the end of my old life would one day feel like a beginning, I wouldn't have believed them. But standing there with the person I loved in a home I built on my own terms, I finally did. We closed the door against the cold, the lights dimming around us. And as the snow kept falling outside, I thought about all the people listening to stories like mine, people still standing in their own storms, waiting for the calm to come. If that's you, I hope you remember this. Walking away doesn't mean you've lost. Sometimes it's the first brave step toward the life that was waiting for you all along. Thank you for listening. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need to hear that peace is still possible even after the coldest nights.